Antique documents worth millions. Techniques that fool America's greatest experts. A master plan so profound it takes years to unfold. And a brilliant mind driven to the absolute edge. (1980), Salt Lake City, Utah. Home of the Mormon Church and setting for a discovery that sends shockwaves throughout America. Mark Hoffman, a first-year medical student, has purchased an old Bible. Stuck between its pages is a mysterious document. Unable to see what it is and unable to safely remove it, Hoffman calls on an expert to help him. He watches on as Professor Jess Simmons, curator of the University Archives, unearths the long-lost Anthon transcript.
And this was a document with strange characters on it that purportedly was produced by Joseph Smith as copies of the characters that came from the gold plates that he translated the Book of Mormon on. So you can see this would be an astounding document. They decided this was a real authentic Joseph Smith document.
All of a sudden, he was the young man that came up with one of the great historical finds of Mormon history.
To the Mormon community, the Anthon transcript is the Word of God revealed to them through the hand of their founder, Joseph Smith. Hoffman sells his amazing find to the Mormon Church for $20,000. Hoffman becomes a star. His status in the Mormon community skyrockets. Church leaders eager to promote Mormon history embrace him. He quits medical school to search for documents full-time. 6 months later, Hoffman makes another incredible find. He unearths 3 Joseph Smith letters that he sells for $95,000. The money pours in. When Hoffman offers to give lectures on his many finds, Mormons line up to learn more about their faith.
I actually remember attending a seminar where Mr. Hoffman spoke about one of his discoveries, and I found it quite fascinating.
He uses these occasions to build relationships with wealthy collectors who compete to buy documents from him.
He would come to see us fairly frequently. He would bring material to sell or trade, and he did it on a regular basis so that you began to count on it.
Obviously, he was coming up with some remarkable finds, and he seemed to be the gatekeeper to the document.
Hoffman tells dealers his amazing success is the result of years of research.
He even hired part-time genealogists to track down descendants of famous Mormon leaders so that he could approach the families and buy documents from them.
Over the next year, Hoffman makes more apparent discoveries, including documents of national importance from the hands of Daniel Boone, Abe Lincoln, George Washington, and Jack London. His fame spreads. The Mormon Church believes he is touched by God.
He certainly had more access to the church historical department. It seemed like they fell all over themselves to allow him to see whatever he wanted to see. He was quite a celebrity at that point.
But what they don't know is, Hoffman is using his celebrity to secretly learn the names, dates, and handwriting styles on the church's most sensitive documents. Information he will use to create the world's most astounding series of forgeries. Because Mark Hoffman is a fraud, and so is everything he sells. Starting at 15 years of age when he fooled the U.S. Treasury with a fake antique coin, he has created over 600 extraordinary forgeries, including the Anthon transcript, the Joseph Smith letters, and materials by hundreds of famous Americans, all of which deceive the world's most discerning experts and net him millions. The question is, how does he do it? Mark Hoffman is a criminal mastermind, making millions with his extraordinary forgeries. But what techniques is he using to fool the world's most respected experts? The paper for Hoffman's forgeries will have to be at least 150 years old. But you can't just get something this rare off the shelf. Or can you? When no one's looking, he helps himself to the blank pages in the backs of old library books. Finding old ink, however, is a lot more difficult.
He had found an old recipe for some ink, how it was made in the 1830s. He was able to make that ink by following this formula.
Hoffman grinds oak nuts and wasp larvae, adds it to ferrous sulfate, then a dash of gum arabic, and finally water. He agitates the light brown mixture until it transforms into a rich dark black. Perfect period ink, right? Foolproof. Wrong. And Hoffman knew it.
He went one step further. He knew that probably there would be a carbon-14 dating of the ink that was used on the document. Because remember, this was going to be a very, very important national document. And so he said, how am I going to counter that? Well, he tore up pieces of that paper that he ripped off down at Brigham Young University and burned it so that it was now carbonized and mixed that in the ink that he used.
This brilliantly ensures that the ink will now date from the 1800s. But to a master forger, the most difficult hurdle is making the ink look 150 years old.
There's many different ways you can artificially age a document. You can do it through treating it with oxygen, through treating it with heat, through treating it with certain chemicals. Hoffman used all of these.
Hoffman soaks the document in a chemical bath of ammonia, the same substance used to clean windows. This has the effect of turning the black ink to a convincing faded brown. And how could he give it a perfect aged yellow color? He uses a household iron. What makes Hoffman's forgeries so convincing is their historical accuracy, the way they perfectly capture both the language and handwriting style of the period. But they're also convincing for another reason. Long before he offers forgeries for sale, he's devised an ingenious ploy.
He donated many documents to the libraries, to the LDS Church at no charge, and then later on would come back with quite a controversial document and maybe charge him $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. As they would seek to authenticate the document, the first thing they would look at was the writing. Well, they would be comparing the writing that Mark Hoffman forged to writing in their archives, and that writing was donated by Mark Hoffman, and that was also forged. So in fact, they were comparing forged writing to forged writing. And this was the downfall of many of the laboratories, including the FBI.
But forgery isn't just about technique. It's also about psychology.
He never wanted to find a document himself. He always had somebody else do it for him. That way the suspicion would never be on him.
That was exactly what happened when Hoffman allowed the professor to discover the Anthon transcript.
As you look back on that, it was a piece of brilliance on Hoffman's part, of someone of that caliber to discover that, quote unquote, in his presence, and then for Mark to act so surprised and, like the rest of them, at what they'd found.
But Hoffman's forgery goes deeper. He creates a false history for the Bible that ties it to Joseph Smith.
Hoffman claimed that he had bought a really old Bible back in Carthage, Illinois, where Joseph Smith had been killed, and he claimed that he had bought this from the descendants of Joseph Smith.
Then, to put the finishing touch to his masterful con, he perfectly forges Smith's signature in the Bible.
He had this ability to understand what people wanted, and he was able to deliver it. And when someone delivers what you really want, you're not as skeptic about it.
Hoffman's documents are so convincing that Brent Ashworth spent $300,000 on them. One of Hoffman's most successful techniques to avoid detection is to never tell one buyer what he's selling to another.
Had we been able to get together and discuss different transactions and things he had said, we could have uncovered the deception.
2 years after selling the Anthon, Hoffman ups the ante, realizing the church will pay a fortune to protect the image of its founder, Joseph Smith. He creates the Salamander Letter, the first in a series of controversial documents that threatens the very foundation of the Mormon faith.
This was a letter that was written by Martin Harris, who was a close friend of Joseph Smith. So it gave the impression that Joseph Smith was kind of a charlatan, practicing in black magic and things like that. It was kind of an embarrassment to the church.
People didn't want to see those documents come to light to protect the church. People wanted to use these documents to expose the church. You had people pulling those documents different ways to use them for their own purposes. That drove up the price. That drove up his status. That made his persona in Salt Lake City.
Hoffman now travels east, craving the thrill of bigger prey. But he knows he'll need a new technique for dealing with such sophisticated experts. He creates an entirely new persona for himself.
He became acquainted with two very sophisticated book merchants back east. I mean, these were guys that were really into the trade, and it was interesting. They kind of looked at Mark Hoffman as kind of a pigeon. He had actually bought books from them at inflated prices, and so they looked upon Hoffman as just this little bumpkin from Utah that they could kind of lead around.
And he made those people think that they were smarter than they were, and he made those people think that he was dumber than they were. And as soon as they thought they were pulling one over on Mark Hoffman, that they were pulling one over on this country bumpkin from Utah, he had them hooked.
Hoffman uses these East Coast dealers to launch his boldest forgery yet, a document that will literally rewrite American history.
The Oath of a Freeman was supposed to be the very first document that was ever printed in the colonies.
And many people thought it was the precursor to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
To create it, Hoffman now masters a completely new technique.
This is a printed document rather than a handwritten document.
Hoffman poses as an innocent history buff and cons a commercial engraver into creating a zinc printing plate.
At the bottom of this is a little disclaimer. This is a replica of the Oath of a Freeman, but when he was ready to use it, he would cut off the bottom portion of this, run some ink that he had made through using his own chemical composition, and then find a piece of paper, place the plate on top of the paper, and by exerting pressure on it, he would then have a document which we now call the Oath of a Freeman.
People believed it was out there, and so he created the document. He filled the hole, and now the scholars are ecstatic because it proves their idea or their theory that the document existed.
This had been authenticated by the FBI, the Library of Congress, the American Antiquarian Society, the McCrone Institute, the University of California, and 2 other independent labs. Every one of them said this was a genuine document.
The Library of Congress tells Hoffman it is seeking authorization for his asking price of $1.5 million. He has reached the pinnacle of the forger's art. But 9 years of criminal activity have changed Hoffman's character.
He started staying in very nice hotels, flew first class. He started buying things. He put down money on a big new house.
Hoffman at that time was getting caught up in the lifestyle. And sometimes crooks begin to believe that what is deception is actual reality.
The mild-mannered Utah bumpkin starts acting like a Wild West gangster, racing his new car into the desert to shoot his Uzi submachine gun. But this bold new lifestyle is about to bring his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. For the last 9 years, Mark Hoffman has been conning the experts with his perfect forgeries. But his extravagant new lifestyle is a real problem. He owes a fortune.
He's like a lot of con men who get involved in these kinds of things. They go through money. They don't make a lot of money, they go through money.
Obviously, there were several deals that weren't working out for him. He was trying to sell that oath of a free man to the Library of Congress.
Demanding more time to test the oath, the Library of Congress refuses to pay Hoffman. He is now so desperate for cash, he decides to forge an entire collection of letters, diaries, and affidavits written by William McClellan, a bitter critic of Joseph Smith.
This was a collection that was supposedly coming out of Texas that would have been very detrimental to the image of the church. Hoffman was promising to produce it.
He conned Steve Christensen, a representative of the church, into fronting him hundreds of thousands of dollars. So now Hoffman's got money, but what he doesn't have is time.
If it was 1 or 2 documents, he could sit down at night and put it together. But if it's hundreds of documents, there's no way he had the time to put that type of collection together.
He didn't produce the collection like he was supposed to. There was a lot of pressure to produce that because a lot of money was tied up in it.
As Hoffman struggles to complete the collection, he sinks deeper into debt and is forced to borrow more money.
Mark came into my store to try to raise money and was very distraught, visibly shaken, pale. I'd never seen him like that.
He would have been under tremendous pressure. There were certain people that were after him for money.
And it isn't long before some of his disgruntled investors get ugly.
He was trying to juggle a whole lot of balls in the air, and at one moment, I think those balls came down, and that's when he became desperate.
Hoffman is now over $1 million in debt. All his brilliant forging skills can't help him. He panics and resorts to violence.
A pipe bomb concealed in a package addressed to Stephen Christensen explodes outside Christensen's office in downtown Salt Lake. Christensen dies in a hail of shrapnel.
Hoffman targets Christensen because he was about to expose Hoffman's financial dealings.
11:20 a.m., another pipe bomb explodes in suburban Holiday.
The second bomb was intended for Christensen's business partner, but mistakenly kills an innocent bystander. Hoffman then builds a third bomb.
There's a lot of speculation as to who the third bomb was for. I think the bomb was intended for Brent Ashworth. They had met on that day of the week for a long period of time. Brent was expected to be at that location, and I really think that Mark had planned to go to that location and set that bomb off in the vicinity of Brent Ashworth.
We would have just walked up to his car like we normally did, and he'd invite me to get in the car, and whammo, I probably would have been killed.
But Brent Ashworth didn't come to town. So now Hoffman has a live bomb sitting on his seat.
October 16th, 2:40 p.m., a third bomb explodes in the sports car of historic documents dealer Mark Hoffman.
Hoffman suffers burns and multiple fractures.
His injuries were not life-threatening, but they were very serious.
When he gives his account of where he was sitting as the bomb exploded, he contradicts the forensic evidence found at the scene. His desperate scheme to escape his creditors has backfired, and now threatens to reveal the truth about his life of deception. Mark Hoffman is lucky to be alive, but his account of the explosion that injured him has made the authorities suspicious.
Well, we decided we had to do a very concerted, extremely in-depth investigation of Mark Hoffman and all of his document dealings.
As investigators circle closer to Hoffman as their killer, the case throws a cloud of doubt on the church's documents and on others Hoffman has sold from coast to coast.
Once we learned that they were forgeries, once we learned that his whole reputation was built up on deceit, we understood why he killed these two people.
Finally, prosecutors make their move.
Mark W. Hoffman has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, a capital offense.
Hoffman pleads guilty to second-degree murder and theft by deception. In January 1988, he appears in court to face sentencing.
Do you think you should ever be free again? Obviously, I want to be free.
By a majority vote, the board has decided that you should serve natural life in prison.
I've never met a person that was so amoral. Everything was about him, about his ability to fool people. His great desire in life was to fool the experts. That's what everything was pointed toward, creating a document and daring the experts to disprove it. And that's what drove him on.
He admitted later that he actually was trying to change church history because he said that he had become an atheist when he was a teenager. He wanted to embarrass the church. He wanted to show that it was false. He wanted to literally change history. But he did it in such a genius way that it was all very plausible.
After 10 years, 800 documents, and 2 murders, the master forger's reign has finally come to an end.